Hi, everybody, and welcome to Mastering the Documentation Challenge. So I have an amazing panel. I am so excited about this session. So we have two Prevail customers with us today, and we also have a representative from one of our C3PAO partners. But you know what? You probably don't want to hear from me anyway, so I'll go ahead and get started. Matt, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself, just a quick intro.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Noel. Obviously, very excited to be here, very grateful. So myself, I'm manager of federal sales. I lead all the business development efforts at Align. We're a cybersecurity assessment and compliance firm. So all sorts of different cybersecurity frameworks we can help with, like SOC 2, ISO, HITRUST, HIPAA. Anything NIST-based really falls under kind of federal for us. So we're a top 3 FedRAMP assessor, and then obviously we're a C3PAO in the CMMC space as well. So I'm excited to be here and to be talking CMMC and everybody's favorite topic, documentation. It's so fun.
Yay! Exactly. Will, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm with Creighton Incorporated. I'm the cybersecurity analyst for Creighton, the first one. And so we're embarking on our CMMC journey at this point. And it's been a bit daunting, but it's wonderful to be here and be with everybody.
Thank you so much. And last and certainly not least, Paul, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself too.
Hi, my name is Paul Miller. I'm an IT administrator at Virtra Incorporated. We're a virtual training company that works with a lot of government and law enforcement agencies. And we are kind of going through our own compliance journey, and I'm heading it up. And it's been a experience and mostly a good one, thanks to Noel.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Noelle Vestal. I'm the compliance officer here at Prevail. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. So I just have a super quick slide to help everybody kind of stay on the same page. So here we go. So I'm just going to review real quickly. Why is documentation important? We hear about it all the time. I actually just did a session and we talked a little bit about documentation earlier, but let's really dive into it a little bit more. So documentation guides your assessor. So that's the goal. You want to be able to tell a story with your documentation, that it is an honest one that represents you clearly and also represents your CMMC boundary clearly as well. Anything you can do to make it easier for your assessment team to get through your documentation and find the answers to the questions they have, the better. And the second bullet point, documentation answers questions for you. So when you are in an assessment, if your there's a lot of controls that if your documentation is suffice and your artifacts and evidence are suffice, they may not even need to ask you a lot of questions about that control. The documentation has already answered the question for you. And then documentation is required for pretty much every single control in one way or another. So that's another reason why it's incredibly, incredibly important to have. I mean, my goodness, there's even a specific control for the SSP itself, the system security plan, which is one of the examples of the compliance documentation we have below. So you can't even get started, literally cannot even get started with your compliance journey until you have a system security plan in place. So just wanted to make sure we level set that. But now that we've kind of talked about why documentation is so important, let's kind of dive into what the experience is with documentation. So I'm going to start with you, Matt. So you're Align's a C3PAO. How important do you think it is as a C3PAO to have robust, well-crafted system security plan as an example?
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. I think you touched on a lot of this, so I'll just echo a lot of what you just had on the previous slide. But from the C3PAO's perspective, it is absolutely critical. I mean, to your point, first of all, it is literally essential to meet all of the controls. But beyond just having a system security plan, having a robust, well-documented one can really be extremely helpful, not just for the C3PAO, but for the organization seeking assessment as well, and just for the whole entire assessment process. It's going to be really critical, obviously, that you have that in place. But just to piggyback off of what you mentioned before, it can really not only point to your evidence of compliance in certain areas, but in some cases that can be part of the evidence of compliance, right? And so I think it's really the base structure. It's the first thing that we really look at, because we get a sense for, who's the organization, how are they meeting these controls, what is going to be assessed in the audit. We kind of put together our plan largely based off of the SSP, because the SSP is really outlining a lot of that for us. So it's really critical, especially in the beginning processes. it obviously organizes the security controls, provides evidence of compliance. It'll help identify risks. But again, beyond that, I can't emphasize enough how much a robust, well-documented SSP really helps streamline the overall assessment process, because it just helps minimize and cut down on the back and forth of communication, of follow-up questions. Like, the more clarity and the more detail and the more efficient answer there is in terms of, hey, I know what they're actually asking for here, and so I'm writing in the SSP what the actual answer is instead of just writing a bunch of stuff and hoping some of that is helpful. All of those things we find extremely helpful, again, especially at the beginning, but then all the way through the full assessment process to make it as streamlined as possible. And let's be honest, nobody wants this to be a long headache. Everybody wants this to be as streamlined as possible, especially on the assessment side. We understand we're in the assessment business. Being audited is not fun. I'm selling services that are not fun. I get that, but we're going to try to make it less stressful on you. And I always tell clients the best place to begin in terms of streamlining our assessment process is who you choose to work with on getting you guys compliant and getting your documentation to a robust, efficient place, because that helps the entire process.
That right there is the perfect segue. Thank you, Matt. So that actually segues me well to my question for you. So you obviously have been the leader of the charge at Creighton for doing your CMMC compliance. So do you feel that when you first started this journey that you really were prepared for what was truly involved in that robust SSP, like Matt was mentioning?
No. Prior to this, coming from a private, small, private equity firm, very boutique kind of a firm dealing mainly in investments and mining, SEC compliance was a thing. And so I had no idea coming to Creighton when I joined about a year ago that they wanted to embark on this journey with CMMC and getting, the certification. I had no clue. And they had a system security plan. And, when we dug into it, it was okay, but it definitely needed a lot of fleshing out. And so I had no clue. Of course, you guys at Prevail have helped quite a bit with that. And I'm really appreciative of that, because now I feel like we do have a system security plan that speaks to the points that Matt was talking about. So,
yeah, that's perfect. I know that was a struggle when you and I had that conversation the first time, and I had to let you know that your system security plan wasn't really there yet. But you handled it so well. So thank you, Will.
Thank you.
And Paul, how long do you feel that it took, over at Virtra to get your SSP to a point where you felt like, okay, maybe we're ready for that first assessment? Maybe, because obviously your system security plan is a constantly evolving document. It's a living document. But how long do you feel like it took you to get to that sort of ready status with your SSP?
I mean, still going. But no, I mean, it's like you said, it's a living, breathing document, and it's shaped and changed all the way to the end. And even now we make notes for revisions going forward in our update cycle. Things change in environments, especially in IT, networking. We recently updated a switch, and so then our network diagram needs to be updated, and then our SSP needs to be updated, and all the supporting documentation for the SSP needs to be checked for inconsistencies. So it's always evolving. But for us in a small business group with a small list of CUI endpoints, it took us like 80 hours of just dedicated time just for the SSP itself. And this is just filling out the document, not even, meeting the controls that each of them describes to get it ready for the assessment. But as far as everything in the document, it took hundreds of hours to implement everything over the course of months, half a year almost.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. We hear numbers like that from a lot of different people. So that makes sense. So this question I have not to exclude you, Matt, but for Matt or for Will and for Paul specifically. So how do you feel that Prevail's pre-filled SSP and the support that you got from myself and the rest of our compliance team really assisted you in going through your assessment process, your CMMC implementation process? And Will, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So it's been extremely helpful to have those pre-filled documents, a template, so to speak, because as you mentioned before, when we answered the question prior to this, the SSP that we had here at Creighton was not fleshed out. And so having a template from Prevail that actually outlined each control and that actually spoke to each of these controls made us look at ourselves and be able to kind of start really filling it out and redoing everything. and looking, practically also looking at everything that we had in place to meet that certification. And so the pre-filled documents, the SSP plus the procedure documentation, which we did not have at Creighton. We had policy documentation, but not procedural documentation to support the SSP. That was extremely helpful in assisting us in getting us on our journey to get that certification.
Wonderful. And Paul, do you have anything to add on how those pre-filled SSP templates and the supporting documentation assisted you too?
I mean, I just have, anecdotal evidence, but I would think it halved our time that we spent on the SSP. And I mean, the pre-filled documents gave us that starting place to make sure we addressed everything in each control and each section. Because like you said earlier, each control has its own life, its own narrative that needs to be answered. It feels like for all the controls, you're just telling a story, for that narrative. And the Prevail template really for us gave us that like springboard to answering each control. And it's still a lot of hard work because there's such a range of systems and all kinds of different CUI out there. And no one template can possibly answer all the questions around each system that these controls have to be applied to. But it really gave us the leverage we needed to like have a starting point. But one of the other like documents that I just think is really the unsung hero from Prevail was the SOP documents for the standard operating procedures. I mean, it really allowed us to tailor them to ourselves and gave us a useful like starting point to modify them to suit our own needs. And then having the language laid out in the SOPs and having some structure, because I mean, I'm an IT guy. I don't have all the fancy language.
I love that last part right there. I talk to so many people who are in IT. I mean, I myself have been in IT for a long time, and it can be such a struggle to find the right words. You do these things day in and day out, but how are you supposed to describe it to somebody? So I think that's a really amazing point to make, Paul, that you are a self-identified an IT person. There are so many people who come into CMMC and are like, well, I don't know anything about IT, so I'm never going to be able to do CMMC. But it's also the IT people who get confused too. So if you are somebody who's in CMMC, and I tell this to customers and prospects all the time, if you're in CMMC and you're feeling overwhelmed by it, and you're an IT person especially, and you're like, why do I not understand it? It's okay. It's totally normal to be a little overwhelmed in the beginning. So Paul, a real quick follow-on question. What would be your advice when specifically for the SSP, the system security plan, for those people who are listening right now, if maybe they're just starting, or maybe they're feeling overwhelmed by the SSP and what they need to do, what would be some tidbits or a quick piece of advice you'd like to give them?
I think the quick advice would be to not try to eat the elephant whole. You definitely want to like piece it out and work through each individual thing one at a time, and try to meet that narrative and realize that you're trying to create that situation for your assessor that once they read it, their questions are answered. Because what you don't want anyone to look at it and say, but what if this, so it's like telling a story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. And Will, the same question to you. What would be your one like big nugget of amazing advice for those people who are out there struggling with their system security plan?
I would say, kind of like echoing Paul, just don't try to eat the whole thing at once, but make sure that your, policies are in place, what you say you're doing, and then your procedural documentation that supports SSP, how you're doing it are all in place, and that it actually is true, right? You can write it down as other people have said, you can write it down, but if you're not checking to make sure that those things are being carried out, then you're kind of in trouble. So that's my piece of advice, is make sure that what the narrative that you're telling is actually what you're doing.
Yeah, that is such a huge piece of advice, and thank you both of you. Those were absolutely fantastic. And truly, if you take nothing else away from this, be honest in how you are documenting everything, and be consistent to both of your points. You need to be consistent. If the procedural document says one thing and the SSP says one thing, that better be what you're doing. If it's not what you're doing, you need to adjust those different documents. So remember, your documentation can be your best friend or your worst enemy. Just depends on how you look at it and how you build it out. Well, thank you. That was amazing. So moving on from the system security plan, and Paul and Will, you both sort of alluded to this. We're going to talk about the other documentation. So a lot of conversation is focused on the system security plan because it is such a huge part of CMMC, but there are a lot of supplemental documents that I think a lot of people don't realize when they first start their CMMC journey. So I'm going to start with you, Matt. Outside of the SSP, what are some examples of documentation that a line as a C3PAO would sort of expect to see in an assessment for CMMC level 2?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're highlighting this because obviously the SSP is something that most people would think of right away. So it's good to highlight there are supporting documents that are critical and very helpful. Again, going back to the slide, I think you guys had highlighted a lot of those, but policies and procedures, most people are familiar with, and that'll come up. Obviously, those are pretty critical. Evidence and artifacts, you guys had mentioned on there. That's obviously going to be very important to us as a C3PAO. We're going to want to see evidence and artifacts that you're doing what you say you're doing. So those are things like, access control tickets, evidence of log reviews, user lists, these sorts of things. Any system documentation could be extremely helpful as well. System configurations. But then, some of the other stuff I'll just kind of highlight that you guys had mentioned as well, like a CRM, like a customer responsibility matrix, especially depending on what clients you have and if there's any controls that you're kind of inheriting or working with other organizations on. We really want to understand who's responsible for what, fully, partially. The plan of action and milestone, something that you guys had on there as well. Obviously, that's critical, even coming into the assessment. And then even through the assessment, hey, we may have some findings and we may need to move into a fourth phase where we have a POAM closeout phase. So that, again, is going to be a living, breathing document. And then I think Paul had mentioned this, the standard operating procedures. Sounds like he was very keen on how critical that was for them. And yeah, I just want to echo everything that you guys were just talking about there about the documentation being your best friend or your worst enemy. I think the worst thing that we can see is we come in and the documentation leaves us with more questions than answers. That's not good. And again, it just leads to a bunch of inefficiencies, especially up at the planning phase. That planning phase could potentially drag out if we read that SSP and we're like, hey, we need to meet because we have a lot of questions to clarify these things. So if you want to move through that more streamlined, the best way is prepare as best as possible. Get all of your documentation in the best order they can, because again, that's the first thing that we're going to review and we're going to start to look at, especially when we're looking at planning the actual assessment.
That's actually a really good point, Matt. So at what point does documentation get sent to the C3PAO? So let's say that I'm an organization seeking certification or an OSC. At what point, let's say I've already engaged with the C3PAO, we have a contract. At what point are you going to start asking me for that supporting documentation like an SSP, SOPs, artifacts, and evidence?
I mean, as soon as you want to give it to us, we will take it is kind of the short answer, but really in the beginning, that first phase, right? And obviously the CMMC assessment process guide is still in a draft form, and there's going to be revisions and there's going to be a final form, but going off of what it is currently and how we've operated in the past, some of the initial is plan and prepare assessment. That's kind of the initial phase. Phase one is plan and prepare. There it is, the assessment. And that is where a lot of the documentation is critical in that. We can't really plan the assessment without knowing, without going through your SSP and figuring out what are we assessing? Is there a CRM who's responsible for what? All these sorts of things. So we will do some level of a review of a lot of this documentation as one of the first things that we do in phase one. Obviously, we're going to continue to review this documentation through the other phases, especially as we move into needing evidence and artifacts for the actual, assessing. But that's a really good point to highlight. Yeah, it is critical from the very onset of your engagement with the C3PAO.
Exactly. And thank you, Matt. We want to make sure to make that point that you can give your system security plan before you start actually having people, on site, if you will, or virtual, or the actual week-long assessment. And you really can, a lot of times, ends up answering some of the questions for the C3PAO before they ever start the assessment if your documentation is suffice enough. So it's a good point to make, that it can make your assessment so much easier. And again, to your point, Matt, too, it can also make it much more difficult, because if you have maybe not robust documentation, or your documentation can also be too robust and you're including too much information, maybe you're getting outside of your own boundary. I feel like because, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever the OSC gives you is what you have to review, correct? Yeah. So that's something to remember, that whatever you tell them is what they're going to be reviewing. If you give them more questions than answers, it's probably not. You don't want your assessor to be on a fact-finding mission. You want to give them the facts up front. Thank you. That was amazing, Matt. Thank you. So a quick question for Will. What are some of the documents that you have now that did not exist before you started your CMMC implementation journey? And why do you feel they're so essential?
Well, we did not have the SOPs, like Paul pointed out, right? The procedural documentation. They had policy in place at Creighton, but those pre-filled documents were really helpful to make sure that, we looked at ourselves in the mirror, so to speak, right, and say, okay, what are we doing? Are we actually doing this? And so those SOPs were artifacts that we didn't have, and now we do have them, thanks to you guys. And so, I feel a lot more confident and comfortable going into, a potential assessment next year to be able to do that now that we have those documents, but those weren't in place. We did have, like we pointed out, that SSP, but now in retrospect, I look at it and I go kind of like, no, we kind of didn't really have one. So yeah, there we go.
And why do you feel like your SSP and your documentation, like now, as you just said, because that's such a good point, looking back at it now with what what would you tell that version of you then, that was like, hey, this SSP is great and everything's ready to go, and that now you obviously know probably wasn't the case?
Yeah, no, I would tell that version of me, back a few months ago, it's like you have no clue, man.
You have no idea, and get some help.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. So Paul, I have a question for you now. So did you have any concerns once you figured out that the SSP wasn't going to be the only documentation you're going to be required to present for your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, for me, once I realized the actual breadth of documentation required, I was just, how am I going to keep all this straight? I felt like I needed my own crime board from a TV show, where they connect the push pins with the strings to keep it all connected together. But I mean, once with Prevail's help, once you get through it, and the nice thing is everybody at Prevail was always willing to sit down and talk with us and help us get it together. But I mean, getting the access list, the SOPs, the network diagrams, the scope diagrams, the training trackers, the documentation on, the systems and wireless access. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But it was a real challenge. But and some environments need more, some need less. Not every place is the same. But with all of the templates that Prevail provided, we at least knew hey, this is you're going to need all this. And, for your environment, maybe you need a couple more, maybe you need a couple less, but yeah. I mean, not everyone.
That guide.
Yeah. Well, especially for me, I'm not just a compliance guy, and, not everyone does just compliance for a living. So having that expertise from Prevail with all of the pre-filled SOPs and the SSP and stuff, the time it saved me.
That's I'm so glad you brought that up too, because I think a lot of people who are listening right now in the audience have the same experience that you do, or that I did when I was implementing this. Compliance wasn't my only job. I had, 25 other things I was doing every single day. So do you think that those people who are in situations similar to you, Paul, where, you're wearing many, many hats in the organization you're working in, and compliance is one of many of those hats, do you think that those are the organizations that do need more help, like, from example, a Prevail or maybe an external consultant or something like that?
I mean, yeah, for sure. Because I mean, we talk about how important scope is, but let's talk about the scope of, managing your own compliance journey as well. Part of scoping part of compliance is scoping, I think part of your journey should be scoping too, because you should know like what you know and be willing to seek expertise from other people, especially if you're not the compliance expert.
And so few of us are.
Right.
Excellent. That's wonderful. So I have a question for both Paul and Will now. So once you realized how much the additional documentation was needed, which I think we've definitely figured that out, did it sort of affect the CMMC timeline? I mean, I'm assuming at the time, before you realized how much documentation you need, you had, an idea of, okay, it's going to be X number of months that it takes to do this. Was that estimate changed in any way after you realized how much documentation you're really going to need? And I'll start with you, Paul.
I mean, I will say that Prevail's timeline that they gave us was actually pretty reasonably plotted. Now, that's not to say I wasn't still blown away by the amount of time, but I mean, when I brought it to, my company, they're like, surely it can't take that long. But I mean, with Prevail's help, we really managed the expectations. Whether I could fit in the 10 or 40 hours or 60 hours a week into working on compliance in my normal schedule was on me. But when Prevail told me something was going to take 60 to 80 hours to document, I mean, it was pretty spot on. The amount of documentation was overwhelming at first, and I had doubts that I could get it done even in the time you told me. But once I got going, I was really surprised by like how accurate it was. I will say though, the one thing that crept up on me was like the fine tuning and document visiting, because nothing was perfect after a first pass. Like I wrote exactly how I wanted to, frame it, exactly how I wanted to document it. And then I read it again, like 3 days later, and I was like, this is rubbish. I need to go again. And then I would approach that, and then I'd have to go to every supporting or attached document. And like I said, it's just like a spider web.
Exactly. I love your crime board is such a great putting it. I love that visual. So Will, same question for you. How do you feel like once you and I had that conversation about that additional documentation, that original timeline you had at Creighton for implementation, how is it altered after that conversation?
No, I mean, we did have to, adjust expectations with leadership and make sure that they understood that it was going to take more time. But, those pre-filled documents, those SOP documents, the SSP, it wasn't just a matter of doing it. Obviously, we want to do it for compliance, but it wasn't just about doing it for compliance. It was about really looking at our processes and procedures and making sure, are we really doing this? If we're going to jot it down for an assessor to look at, are we really doing this, and are we doing it to the best of our ability, and are we documenting it properly? So it did increase our timeline because it made us self-reflect and look and see to make sure that we are doing, the best that we could for the company in itself, but also for compliance, right? So it did help in being realistic about when we could actually go for assessment.
So do you think that the timeline increased a lot, or just maybe a little bit?
A little bit. I mean, I think it's you have to go back, like Paul said, and kind of revisit the documents, retool them a little bit, make sure that you're spot on with what you're stating on those documents, whether it's the SSP or the procedural documentation. And so it increased it a bit, but I don't think it was, I don't think it's, a long length of time.
Yeah, not insurmountable.
No, not insurmountable.
Exactly. Love that. Love that. Thank you. That was fantastic. And we're coming to the end here. So I just have one last question. So I'll start with you, Will. How do you know that your documentation is ready for an assessment or close to ready for an assessment? What are those markers that you have that tell you that?
Just to make sure that the documents line up, right? That what we're saying in our SSP is documented in our policies, that those are being carried out by employees, and that the procedural documentation, the SOPs also match up with that we actually do what we say we're doing. That if all those line up, then I think we're good to go.
I love it. And Paul, same question to you. How do you know that your documentation is ready for that assessment?
For me, it's about, that narrative that we've been talking about this whole time. And like I said previously, you don't want to read through and have someone immediately ask, but what if this? If you can read through that and it like passes all your logical tests, and then you can start to maybe ask, am I ready? But I know for us, like what we've, looked at is, a smart use is like a gap assessment for ourselves.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you want to be prepared, and you don't want to like get partway into your assessment and have, an assessor point out something and you have no recourse or answer because you haven't even thought about it. And for us, that gap assessment was like having a proofreader and not having to test in production because,
that's the best way to put. I love that. A proofreader, you don't have to test in production. That's perfect. I know that we're at our time now. I could talk to you guys about this all day. This has been so fantastic. Thank you so much again, Paul, Will, and Matt, for joining me today for this session. It's been absolutely amazing. I mean, I feel like I even learned something today. So thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful to have you here.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Thank you.
Noel. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me.